What's an impasse? It's a reason that the discussion isn't working from the speaker's point of view. It takes logical priority over continuing the discussion, because if the discussion won't work, cannot work, is failing, then you should deal with that problem instead of doing the thing that will not work. If someone thinks continuing as normal won't work, then asking them to continue as normal, to do something they think will fail, is a bad idea. You have to try to deal with the problem, or just give up and stop talking. Impasses are strong stuff. If someone just makes a mistake, you're not stuck. That is not a reason the discussion is going to fail. You can just point out the mistake. You can explain the problem. That is a normal part of discussion. An impasse is a reason the discussion is actually not working. It's a reason for failure rather than having to deal with some kind of problem. Impasses are pretty common anyways, despite being pretty strong. Discussions often do fail. So we have to deal with them reasonably often. Usually, when there's an impasse, then that's basically the end of it. The discussion fails. If you can actually point out an impasse and talk about it, you have a chance to save discussions and rescue them and fix what was wrong. If you never talk about impasses, then a lot of your discussions are going to fail. Talking about impasses can also save time and end discussions faster than if you try to ignore it. Even if it doesn't fix the problem, you could at least notice the problem and talk about it, give it more attention, and then decide to give up more quickly instead of just carrying on with the discussion that is failing. Talking about impasses also gives more clarity about why discussions failed and what you think the other person did wrong. Instead of just refusing to talk more, you actually point out a problem, a reason that you're not talking more, which gives them the opportunity to see what they did wrong and potentially change their mind and learn something. Even if the discussion ends, they can get a benefit from finding out why it ended, what happened, what the problem was from your point of view. Also, sometimes what you think is an impasse is actually a misunderstanding. So if you say what you think the problem is, they might say, oh, no, you're misreading me. I see how that was ambiguous, but actually I meant this other thing, not the way you read it. There could be a misunderstanding. It's your fault, their fault, no one's fault, and it could get fixed. Some impasses are actually easy to fix because they're just based on a fairly simple misunderstanding. And then other impasses are often quite a bit harder to fix, but sometimes you can do it. And if you talk about impasses, it gives the audience more information. It lets them judge. It's kind of like writing a conclusion where you explain your final statement about what happened in the discussion. And so the audience gets more information. And so if both people say, I think there's an impasse and it's your fault, here's what it is, and they both make that final statement, then anyone reading the discussion has a lot better information to decide who was right, who was wrong, who was reasonable, who was unreasonable, etc. Impasses can come in chains. A chain is when you have an impasse about an impasse. So if you're discussing impasse number 1, you might have an impasse in that discussion. So that's impasse number 2. And then if you start discussing impasse number 2, you could run into an impasse, which would be impasse number 3, and so on. A chain is different than separate impasses. You could have an impasse about the first discussion and either ignore it or solve it, and then have another impasse about the original discussion. That's not a chain, it's a separate impasse. A chain requires the impasse to be about the previous impasse, and then to chain further, you have to have an impasse that's about the previous one, and so on and so on. So the impasses have to be linked together to form a chain. When you have a chain of impasses, the highest numbered impasse, the most recent one, takes priority, because it is a reason that the previous thing will not work. But there's no reason that it won't work. As the most recent topic, no one has pointed out an impasse with it. So it is the one topic available that has no claimed impasse. No one, from their point of view, thinks that it is failing. So you can talk about it. People often respond to impasses by talking about the wrong thing. So you point out an impasse, and then they try to continue the original discussion in a way that solves the problem, but they don't actually respond to the impasse. They don't say, oh, hey, that makes sense. I think I know how to solve it. I have the following plan. Let's continue. At which point you would know that they're making a change that might solve it. But if they just don't explain what's going on and try to go back to the original discussion, then you're going to feel ignored. And you might actually be ignored. Often their plan is bad. It won't work. If they told you the plan, you would say, oh, no, that doesn't solve the problem. I don't want to continue with that plan. Sometimes the plan is perfectly good, but sometimes it's not, and they should just say what it is so you know that you're being heard and that they have a plan and that you can give feedback on the plan. You can say okay to it or say no, and here's why. It's similar to what I've called a question ignoring discussion pattern. I have a blog post about that one, where you ask a question and people ignore it and continue with the previous discussion. So the standard pattern is I say, what do you think about X? And then they don't say anything. And then I say, why didn't you discuss X? And then they start saying their opinion about X. Instead of answering why didn't they discuss X, they start discussing X, which is not the question I just asked. It's not a response. So this action ignores the question that was most recently asked. And often I don't want to go back to the original topic after the silence. I want to know, why were they silent? What happened? There seems to be a problem that's getting in the way of our discussions. I don't want to just ignore it and hope it doesn't happen again. If they have some plan to not go silent again, I want to know what it is and judge for myself if that's a reasonable plan that I want to continue with while they use that plan. Or I might say, oh, I don't like that plan. I don't want to keep talking unless we come up with a better plan. So the thing they're doing here is going back to the previous meta level. This was an object comment. It was a level 0 comment. And then this was a level 1 comment. It was about the previous discussion instead of about the original topic. So it's one meta level. And if you can chain meta levels just like you can chain impasses. Each impasse is in fact a one higher meta level. So the impasse number is the meta level number. And impasse discussion is meta discussion. So here you're asking a level 1 meta question, and then they ignore you and they talk at level 0. They're going back to the one previous one. And if you point out an impasse and then someone doesn't respond to the impasse and keeps talking about the original topic, they would again be talking at a lower meta level than what you just talked about. But the higher meta levels have priority, logically. So it is bad to go back to the earlier meta levels and just ignore the higher ones. Because the higher ones are about some issue with the previous one, the lower one. So pointing out an issue with what was going on has priority over just continuing what was going on. And if someone is pointing out dumb impasses or bringing up dumb meta comments, like unnecessary things, distracting things, derailing things, etc., you still shouldn't just ignore it and go back to the original thing. There's an actual problem there, like they're doing something wrong, they're trying to screw up the discussion, or they're making a mistake, or whatever. You should point out why their impasses or meta comments or whatever are inappropriate, wrong, unnecessary, whatever it is. Deal with the problem, address their error instead of trying to ignore it. So if their meta level is bad, you need to go to the next meta level above and comment on it, or talk about it at the same meta level. You can make criticisms at the same meta level, but you can also talk about it and go to the next one, depending how bad it is and how much you need to separate the discussion from it and get distance from it and treat it as a thing to be discussed from a different level rather than part of the current discussion. It's similar to the issue of when you're having a discussion and someone makes a mistake, usually you can just point out the mistake and it can be part of the discussion. You don't have to say there's an impasse or go to meta discussion. It's only certain mistakes where you want to take a step back and go to a meta level and talk about it rather than continue the discussion normally. It's the mistakes where things are like really stuck or problematic. Whereas if you just have a normal mistake, you can just talk about it as part of a normal conversation. Counting meta levels can be a bit ambiguous, and it doesn't particularly matter. It's not important to have the right count, whether it's like 5 or 7 or whatever. We don't need to measure how meta our discussion has gotten.